Does a kid become an adult without a parent? Not easy. If the baby boomers are who some of you say they are, many of you say they are, then the parents are responsible, really. And these are the parents kind of defending themselves, because back in 1989 when I did this, I was asking parents, hey, are you responsible for your kid? Did you make this kid? And these are the answers that I got.
Those of us who brought the baby boom into being, the returning World War II veterans, we didn't know what the hell we were doing. I mean, we really didn't know. We all came home and we all had children. There was no advice, really. Dr. Spock had a book out, but we didn't know anything about child rearing. In other words, let me try to say it this way. There were certain things that you just did. We didn't know anything about relationships, communication between husband and wife. There was very little communication. Children, child rearing, how do you raise children? No one knew. In other words, it was supposed just to happen.
The parents of the 1950s were, I think, the most unusual generation of the 20th century. These are the people who had grown up in the Depression. They had experienced real tough times when they were children and when they were teenagers. And then World War II hit, as many of them were just reaching adulthood, and they had the trauma of the war. And then, after all that, they reached the 1950s at a time when the U.S. was tremendously prosperous, when the economy was booming as we've never seen it before. And I think they reacted to that prosperity, and I think they reacted strongly to all of the trauma of the Depression and the war by turning inward a bit, by marrying young, by emphasizing home and family, as if that was something they couldn't get back in the 30s and 40s and now valued all the more.
It was a perfect setting in which the youth culture, in a certain sense, could blossom. Life in the suburbs was organized around the kids again. They were the center of attention, endless round of Little League games and PTA meetings, etc. So it was in the suburbs, in a certain sense, that this message about the importance and the uniqueness and the generational potency associated with these kids, I think, was delivered with real force.
This was a distinctly new way to be raised in the world. And it allowed for a whole generation that I suppose we would now call spoiled kids, which from another point of view simply meant kids who had very high expectations in life with respect to freedom and happiness. They thought life was about being free and about being happy. And they carried those expectations forward into high school and into college, and brought with them a kind of a level of expectation that was simply unprecedented in, I would say, in world history.
This whole image of giving your children everything you had, and they have to be satisfied and they have to be content, and I think we gave them much too much.
We found out in the 50s that if you got up in the morning and went to work and did a good day's work, the things got better. You got promoted or you got more money, you were able to buy furniture, you could have more children, the children could have better clothes, and life just improved. We knew it was because you went to work. But I'm not sure our children realized that. They saw simply that the clothes got better, the house got bigger, the neighborhood got nicer. And I have a strong suspicion that what happened in the late 60s was that the kids who rebelled took it for granted that life would improve automatically.
I wanted to give a little time for the video I put out to be seen, and before addressing kind of the other side of the coin, which I had always intended to do to a certain extent. But I wasn't expecting Jacob to share my video in a attack mode towards Mark, and apparently Mark had a stream where he was very upset with it and took the stream down. So he didn't finish the video. I think if he had finished the video, he would have hopefully gotten the point that I was trying to get across. For anybody who's watching my channel, if you see that I have longer videos, I have a real hard time putting the thing that I really want to get across up front. I know that's an important thing to do, but it's the videos are always reflecting my thought process, and so usually it starts with me kind of attacking the question, the problem, and then by the end I get to the resolution. So the most important part of almost all my videos is at the end. So if you don't watch it to the end, you're really going to see a very different characteristic to my videos, because this is me dealing with questions and problems and trying to work it out. And usually I come to a good place by the end, but it takes the process to get there. So I want to talk about some stuff, and this is some thoughts I had bouncing around, and obviously I couldn't fit everything in one video. It's a huge topic, and some of the comments gave me some other things to think about. Because I realized that some of the material that wasn't mine was presenting things maybe in a very generalized way, or I want to be accurate, and so I think that there are some points to address. So for instance, I'll just kind of go through this list and see how it gets. Okay, so the permissive parenting thing. So some of the problems with like the baby boomer generation is attributed to the permissive parenting of their parents, of the boomers' parents. And so the permissive parenting that they received and some of the bad moral behavior, the 60s culture, it was not a simple causal relationship. It wasn't just like action and consequence. Permissive parenting leads to bad behavior. That's not necessarily the case. The boomer parents, the parents of the boomers are called the silent generation. And I think that that's really appropriate for some of the hands-off approach that the parents of the boomers took in raising their children. But it was not intentional. They were really being thrown, into this thing. They didn't have experience. The traumatic experiences leading up to it were so great. America had been in survival mode for like basically 40 years or so, or at least 30 years, since like World War I. So permissive parenting gives children over to the arenic forces. It gives the children into the environment. And so it's not necessarily going to always cause bad outcomes. It's dependent on the environment in which it is done. And there was a lot of good things in America at that time. There was also some bad stuff. Without the guardrails of religion being in place as much, though they were still there, but especially without a good explanation for the religion. And I would say that was a big problem. What remnants of religion were still in place, in the 50s, were very much carried on through tradition. This is what we do. We go to church. We say these things. The average churchgoer didn't have answers to specific questions. And, you always hear about these questions. I think these questions are natural, perpetual questions that kids come up with, like, why did God do this? It's the stuff Alex O'Connor asks, like, why did God make Eve be deceived, or something like that? Kids want to ask these questions, and the adults, most of the adults weren't well informed enough to answer well, but they also didn't even have a culture of being able to say, I don't know, that's a good question, let me find out. Because this tradition also included a tradition of authority structures, in roles, like listen to your elders. You have to assume that the authority knows everything. And so if they just say, because that's the way it is, you can't question it anymore, because at that point you're not asking a question, you're questioning authority. And the traditional culture didn't allow for that very much. So without good reasons to explain why we held on to these traditions, they were then up for grabs to be pushed away. And because you had such an abundance of kids, and it was such large peer groups, and there was some hands-offness from the parents, which is understandable. It was just an open thing for people to explore. And so many people went further down destructive paths, sex, drugs, rock and roll, than they otherwise might have gone if there had been some more guardrails in place. And essentially they were deceived because like Eve was in the garden, because, you know, she was consenting to an action whose consequences she can't really fathom prior to the experience. And that's how it goes with sex and drugs, especially, you know, for the first people on the scene. By the time you get to the 80s, you have something to look back on. And even, you know, when you get into the 70s, it's a different scene than the 60s, you know? So you can't fault the people for whom this was a totally brand new experience. It was experimental. Like being in the Garden of Eden, and there's the rules, you know, so in the Garden of Eden, there was all this freedom. It was a very good environment to be in. Like, if you imagine children being raised, there's not a much better place than the Garden of Eden. There's only one thing that will get you in trouble in there. But the difference is that Adam and Eve had the warning. They knew they weren't there about that one tree that they were supposed to not touch, not eat from. And so, even as vague as that warning was, and how much responsibility we put on them varies from tradition to tradition, but I think that it was ultimately something that was inevitable, because they can't understand, what does it mean to die? You know, what does that mean? If nobody's ever died, how can you understand it? So vague as that warning was, though, it did make them culpable for their actions. And at least they were responsible for, why didn't they ask more questions? Or why didn't they try some other thing? You know, they had some amount of responsibility because they had a warning. But that wasn't the case for basically this huge amount of kids growing up after World War II without a ton of structure. In my closer analysis, I think the better way, even better than the Garden of Eden, is if you think about the post-war boomer landscape, it was actually much more like the world after the flood. You know, Noah after the flood, it's like a partial reset. And what Rudyard was saying in his video about the boomers seeing themselves as like the start of history, he was saying it in kind of a cynical way, but it is kind of true, because World War II is so momentous, and then you have such an abundance of people being born, that the like ratios of teachers and parents to children is unbalanced. So it really was like a start of a new world. So if you think about the world after the flood, it's like a partial reset. And what happens is that it was kind of, Noah kind of confused it for the final situation or whatever. Like, he's like, I did it. I made it through the flood. Now I'm going to settle down. I'm going to plant my vineyard. I'm going to drink my wine. And basically, he wasn't on guard enough to protect his children. So in a lot of ways, like the similarity between like Noah in that story of Noah and his sons is very much, you could see that as like the soldier returning home from World War II, he's not prepared to have a battle. He's fought his epic battle, so he's not battling the kids that he's trying to raise. He wants to be generous, and you know, so they wanted to look forward. They didn't want to dwell on the past. They didn't want to dig up those bad memories, but there were still dangers present in the world, and so that's kind of the problem. But, you know, like that same situation, it is kind of tipped in the favor of humanity. You know, and I would say the world is still a better place in a lot of ways than it was before World War II. So the parents and grandparents of the boomers went through a whole series of traumas. World War I, the Great Depression, World War II. They were in survival mode like through that whole time. And this post-war peace period was really the first opportunity, not just for the returning soldiers, but for multiple generations of Americans to start families. So there was a lot of people, you know, who weren't able to achieve any economic success or whatever until after that period. And so, you know, you had some people that were older parents having kids for the first time. Some people were young parents having kids for the first time. And these parents, because it was such a traumatic experience going through these multiple wars and depressions, very few of these parents had the experience of a genuine good quality childhood themselves. You know, they were like having to work all the time as kids to keep the family fed. It wasn't, they didn't get to play. They didn't, you know, so they're wanting to give their kids something they didn't have, but it's also something that's even difficult for them to imagine. Like, because if you're just going from survival mode from generations, how do you adjust to a totally new kind of world that you're living in? So the returning soldiers, they didn't know anything about marriage or parenting, except that those are good things to pursue. And the war was a traumatic time, and it was not something that they were willing to talk about, and nor could they process it well. They didn't have all the mental health apparatus to deal with PTSD and all those things. And so that almost certainly made it difficult for their children to ask about it as well. And so I'll share some of my personal experience from what I know. Like, so my mother, my grandmother, my mom's mom, got married because it was the thing to do. That's what she said. They were from Kansas. She got married to a guy that neither of them really were doing it, other than it was sort of cultural inertia. And then my mom was born. They moved to New England, and then when they got there, my mom's dad fell in love with the neighbor and ran off. And so my grandmother was single for a while. She ended up getting remarried to the grandfather that I knew, who gave my mom, adopted my mom, gave her his last name, and but he was not a great father. And she told me even that she would ask him things. She would ask him about his childhood, and he would just ignore her. And she would ask him about his experience in the war. And he was in Europe, and he had some wounds and things. And so he didn't want to talk about it. He literally ignored her when she would ask. So she just learned, okay, this isn't a thing we can talk about. And I think that was probably a pretty common experience. Now, on my dad's side, his dad served in stateside, because he had an unusual circumstance where his father had actually passed away in the influenza epidemic of 1919, and he was 4 years old, and he had a younger sister, and so he was raised by a single mom. And so he had some uncles that helped out and stuff, but he didn't experience good fatherhood, and it just was an unknown thing. And because of that, because he was the only remaining son, he got to serve on the stateside. He was a drill instructor. He didn't have to go overseas during the war. So that was probably more of a positive thing, and so he wasn't traumatized in that way, but he was ill-equipped in some ways to raise a family. And I remember my dad telling an experience about how his older brother was kind of getting a little too serious with a girl that he was dating, or he was getting himself in a little trouble or something, and my grandmother was concerned, and so she talked to my grandfather and said, you have to do something about this. And all my grandfather could think to do was he said you be nice to that girl, but he didn't have any specific advice about how you're supposed to court a girl, or what's inappropriate or appropriate or anything like that. So it's they were ill-equipped in a lot of ways. And so I think then you get this thing where the whole war experience, it's this mythological topic that affects everything about your life, but you cannot ask questions about it. It's taboo. It's too traumatic. The parents aren't talking about it. It's certainly not probably when the kids are young. I'm sure when a lot of the boomers grew up and got older, they were able to have some more of these conversations with their parents, after time. The thing is that there was really different waves of baby boomers, and I think, that's an important thing to realize, and I understand that. So, my uncles are older, 10 and 8 years older than my dad, and so they were, born in the 40s and like had that kind of firstborn son thing, you know. They were all the traits that firstborns or older children have, you know. Times were tighter for them, you know, the family was new. By the time my dad was born, the family had been experiencing success for a little while. You know, I don't think that the people after World War II necessarily expected there to just be like constant economic growth for the next 50 years. That would be, because that was totally unprecedented. So for the first generation of kids, they were probably given, I mean, I think you can see it in the different people within that generation, but they were probably prepared a little bit more for, you know, you need to be diligent, you need to save, you need to work hard, you need to be responsible. And then by the time the younger kids start coming along, you know, everybody's got more money, everything's easier, the existential threats have not come about for a while. And so, you know, that's the group where you have kind of getting involved in all the crazy stuff of the 60s. And that was my dad. He fell into all that stuff. Now, so in contrast between like my dad and my uncles, both my uncles were very successful financially. They did really well, and you know, they just skated by that whole kind of 60s thing more or less. Well, I get the younger of the two, you know, he smoked a little dope or whatever, but not like, he wasn't like a real hippie or whatever. But then, you know, like my dad got into that stuff and it was much more prevalent. And, you know, that's when there was more of the protest stuff going on and all the debates about Vietnam and why are we doing this and kind of that stuff. So there really is some differences between the boomers. They're not a big lump sum, and so there's some differences there, and it's important to know. Yeah. So I think the other thing that's really important to realize, you know, and I'm speaking this a lot of this is for the people of my generation to understand, because it is important, because this is our parents that we're talking about, you know, for the most part. And I would say like TLC, I was saying to somebody, this is like a place where it's mostly millennials and Gen Z people, and most of what we're struggling with is trying to figure out the world that the boomers created to a certain extent. And so that's something to be said. And I would say that most of the boomers that are in this space, you know, like PBK's on the border, but like Mark or Sherry and other people, I would say, really, if you are in here, it's probably because you're not like a prototypical boomer, the way that people think of it. And I think that it's probably important for people of my generation to understand that when we have these narratives about like how a generation was, and especially like the most populous generation of all time, you know, there was like an influencer class that was shaping the narrative of this time. And a lot of people were excluded from that. Many people did not have a summer of love kind of thing. Many people did not have any involvement in political activism. I think there was probably a big divide between people who went to Vietnam for all the same good reasons that their parents had served in World War II and Korea and other wars. And there's a big difference between those people and the people who were dodging the draft and who were protesting. And that divide obviously continues when those veterans came home. And I think that, you know, there's a lot of evidence just that Vietnam veterans have been very poorly treated by their peers, really, which is pretty awful. So, you know, that's something. And I think, you know, if you look at like the people that are in the political class, like somebody like George W. Bush, and
Morning. Yeah, I'm distressed to hear about the latest suicide bombers in Israel. For those who yearn for peace in the Middle East, for those in the Arab lands, for those in Europe, For those all around the world who yearn for peace, we must do everything we possibly can to stop the terror. There are a few killers who want to stop the peace process that we have started, and we must not let them. For the sake of humanity, for the sake of the Palestinians who suffer, for the sake of the Israelis who are under attack, we must stop the terror. I call upon all nations to do everything they can to stop these terrorist killers. Thank you. Now watch this drive.
All right, you need another. Our new speaker. Right? What? Trying to be talked out of the mug.
See you at church.
You look at like the clip of him showing off his golf drive or whatever with his dad driving the golf cart, and they're going to go to church later, and it's just like, this is such a surreal experience. Like, you know, he was like this little prince that just skated into the White House on golden skates or something, you know, like his experience is very different from the vast majority of boomers, but he's the person that kind of like represents a lot of that class. And you could say similar things for all the other boomer presidents that we've had. But what I was trying to get at with my video is, and what I was calling like boomerality, is this tendency of judge not, lest ye be judged, and also kind of judge not unless someone is judging. And like the making the judging and finger pointing like the ultimate sin. And I'm not saying any specific person does this, not necessarily isolated to the baby boomer generation, but it is very prevalent. And I think it's an important thing for baby boomers to understand in regards to why the people of my generation, your kids' generation, are, you know, feeling this way about the world, and why we're having like a meaning crisis and things like that. And, you know, there's some big concerns that I have. I saw a tweet where Doug Wilson had made a video about like why anti-Semitism is bad, which I think should be a pretty easy thing for people to understand. But because it was like held as this is the most obvious right thing by our parents' generation, and our parents have not, I would say, adequately explained the reasoning behind their moral landscape to us, you just have people pushing back because it's something that they can push back on. So like there's a tweet where he's talking about Doug Wilson, and the guy says, well, Doug doesn't deserve a response. Thank him for his past service and for the books on masculinity and family, and move on entirely. No boomer is capable of leading where we need to go. And so, like, wow, if you think about it, you know, if we're saying the boomers were basically very heavily shaped by the fact that their parents were hands-off, well, now we have my generation basically deciding we will refuse to listen to anything that our parents' generation has to say. We are going to intentionally remove them from our sphere of influence. We are setting ourselves up to make a lot of mistakes. Most of the people in my generation don't seem to understand the seriousness of the problem. And so, you know, it's funny to make the jokes and say, okay, boomer, and stuff like that. And I put the little clip of Mark talking about how he gets anxiety from people, you know, making strong judgments, because it was funny to me, like, because it's very much an attitude that I've seen in my parents' generation and, you know, other people that I know. So it wasn't trying to be mean or anything like that. You know, it's just, you got to learn. If you learn to laugh at yourself a little bit, things will be better. But so here's the thing. and this is the problem with like the judge not thing, what I call the boomerality. When we have excuses for sin, which is we didn't know, our parents didn't raise us right, that's an excuse. Okay, that's fine. But when you have an excuse, someone still pays the price. For millennials, it's the boomers that pay the price. We have the excuse where we see the baby boomers as taking something that they should have left for us in terms of wealth and opportunity. We see our parents' generation as being selfish. And so our excuse for why our life has not manifested the way that we wanted is because of our parents' selfishness. For the boomers, it's their parents who pay the price. They didn't teach the boomers what to do, what not to do. So the mistakes that they made were not their fault. And this can keep being pushed back. The excuse keeps pushing the fault up the chain, you know? So you can just keep going back and blame, every generation blames their parents till we get back to Adam and Eve in the garden, and we say if they just hadn't eaten the fruit. That does not accomplish anything. Or, you know, I think the different thing that happened was that essentially what we did is we ended up lumping it all on Hitler. And if you watch the end of my video, you can see very clearly why that ends up being a problem. But the other problem with this thing of judge not and excusing sin is that we get trapped in spiritual blackmail. Spiritual blackmail can happen when another person knows of our sins and they trap us with that knowledge. And whether somebody else knows about it or not, the voice of the serpent is there telling us, don't confess because they won't understand and it's going to cost you. And so if people get caught, they don't say what I did was wrong and take responsibility. If they have an excuse, they use the excuse. So then the guilt, the cost of the sin is pushed off. But it creates cycles of misery where the patterns are perpetuated, because you're trapped in your sin. You can't judge somebody else for what they're doing because you may be exposed. And so what you have is everybody hurting each other all the time and ignoring the wounds that they're receiving from everybody else because because they're afraid of their own weaknesses and failures being exposed. So this is really important, and I would say especially as it involves like this little corner of the internet, because so much of this little corner is people who kind of deconstructed or they've had something spiritual deconstruction or something, but it is always happening in reaction to the world of our parents' generation. And I think if you see like this move where people are deconstructing from their parents' faith, like evangelical Christianity is the most boomer version of Christianity, and it made the most sense to boomers, and it was made by boomers, and all that Jesus people stuff that came out of the hippie scene, and then all the like Rick Warren like business stuff that came out of the 80s boomers that were more financially responsible. Like it's all boomer stuff. And so what you have now is people in my generation being like, okay, that didn't work for me because they weren't getting their questions answered. But now they find something through Jordan Peterson or something. It leads them to orthodoxy or trad Catholicism or some other weird thing, some different kind of thing. And what that move to a different type of faith does is it circumvents reconciliation. And a person can forgive without reconciliation. So this is usually done to protect us from future harm. And I would say so I forgave my parents of the things that they did in raising me that hurt me, the things that I didn't understand, the things where a lot of it was unintentional, some of it was mistakes, whatever. But I forgive them for that. And I could say, I forgive them, but I'm not going to reconcile because there's too much chance of them causing future harm. So I'm just going to disengage from them. I'm going to be separate. But true reconciliation requires both parties to be engaged, or it requires the person to forgive, being willing to put themselves in the place of being hurt again or whatever. And I'd say overall, it's easier for parents to forgive children than vice versa, especially if the children have not seen that repentance modeled. But this means that it has to be real forgiveness and not excuses, not tit for tat, quid pro quo, the thing that keeps the peace, where you're saying like, well, I'm not going to judge you for your mistakes if you're not going to judge me for mine. That's not forgiveness, nor is that repentance. That's excusing. That's excusing a sin. You're just not dealing with it. You're keeping the peace, but where is that sin? Where is that pain residing? It's residing in the individuals, and it doesn't go anywhere. So the greater move, I think, and does need to come from the boomers to their children's generation, to the millennials and the Gen Zs, and even the Xers or whatever too, I guess. Like, it's interesting because I see this in this what happens with the people that deconvert from their parents' faith, find faith in a different tradition, and then what they're trying to do is they're trying to get their parents to come into that tradition, and that's like the easy thing. That's the child understanding that this is like the easier move, because that's allowing an excuse, in a sense, or what it's allowing the parent to do is to say, I'm going to agree with you that the evangelical Christianity was the problem, not my own actions, and I'm going to go along with this thing to keep peace with my child, which I think is the same reason why it's so easy for like parents, and especially probably the boomers, to just go along with the thing of like gender affirmation, or kids coming out as gay and the parents accepting them and affirming them, because they know I've made mistakes, and if I just affirm and accept what my child does, I will continue to be in a relationship with them. And so that that's not good, because the child's not trying to truly reconcile. But like I said, it's harder for the child to have to do that. Like, I shouldn't have had to be the one that said to my dad, what you did was wrong and it hurt me, but I forgive you. And and even in doing that, then what am I putting myself in the position? I'm putting myself in the position of my father being, he can then say, you are right, I repent, what I did was wrong, and I'm sorry that it hurt you. I didn't want it to hurt you, or I regret that happened. Or he can say, well, I was trying to do my best. And if a parent says that, that's trying to get their sin excused instead of repenting of it. That's not going to create real reconciliation. But what I would say is that it's far easier for the parents, if they can do it, to make that move, to own up to their mistakes, take full responsibility, take more responsibility. And really, but I guess it goes the other way, because what that may require is that you need to do the same to your parents. You may need to forgive your parents, rather than just using them as an excuse for why you are the way that you are. So I think that's something hard to do. Baby boomers have so much wisdom and knowledge, and our generation desperately needs it, but there's a big disconnect in our communication, and it's not coming across. And I think one of the reasons why is because baby boomers, and when I say this, I'm speaking just literally of my parents and things, not just the people that are in this corner that are of a certain age. they want to lead from their success. And I think this is the point that caused a lot of frustration. You know, like if they've been financially successful, they want to tell their kids, well, here's how here's how we did it. We got these jobs and we saved our money and we bought a house. And that you don't know how much of your success is due to environmental circumstances. You want to take credit for it, but that wasn't you. So don't try to lead from your success. Or I would say, and another one is like parenting. You know, my wife and I, we've both had frustrations with our parents trying to parent our kids, and you know, basically, and what they're saying is that, well, we did it this way, and we are the ones who you parented, and we're saying, yeah, you did it that way, and we don't think that was right. So when you try to do it with our kids, it's frustrating. So we don't want you to be parents. We want you to be grandparents. Be grandparents, leave the parenting to us. You know, that's like a little bit of an argument that we've had to have with my parents, and my wife's had to have with my father-in-law. So don't try to do that. Don't try to lead from your success, because we see through your success. We're trying to do this stuff. Many of us are trying to follow your steps, and it's not working. Others of us are trying to follow the opposite of what you did, and that's also not working. What we really need is for you to lead from your wounds. And that is, I think, the greatest thing that the boomers have to contribute, is if they tell us all the places, you know, drop the facade of being the wise person who knows, and tell us about how you were carried through despite your mistakes, how God was able to use your mistakes to bless you, and how other people you know, helped you out when you weren't able to do it, and where you did pay the consequences because of your mistakes. Like, own that and embrace that. That's the most valuable thing you have. And I think that's painful, but I think that's like literally the most needed thing in our world, is for our parents' generation to repent of their sins, stop excusing themselves for the mistakes they made, and just try to repair the bond. Otherwise, you know, the only way forward for us, which, you know, is the same thing, is to forgive. You know, we also need to forgive the mistakes that our parents have made, but not to vilify them, not to pin the blame for everything that goes wrong in our life on our parents. So, you know, that kind of got into a little bit more of a rant than I had planned, but hopefully it makes sense. You know, this stuff's all really complicated. But I think my other video, what I wanted to do was really get the people my age to get into it, and, you know, be, yeah, you're right, and then try to get them to think a little bit differently about what's going on. And I think that I accomplished that from what I can get. You know, like Phlebas told me that he was convicted of his sin from my sermon. So, you know, I'm sharing it because I'm convicted of my sin. That's why I do this stuff. So anyway, hopefully this kind of fills out that other side of that coin, and maybe lead to better communications intergenerationally, because I think that's really important. We all want tradition. We all want something that lasts. And the only way that you really get that is if you can get along with those who came before you. So, let me know what you think.